You know, Chicago Studies is, as a unit, one of the main reasons we exist is to encourage curiosity about the city on the part of the college community. You may have experienced this. You may know other people for whom, you know, Hyde Park is kind of like all of Chicago they ever experience. Um, and we're kind of desperate to make sure that that doesn't happen. And so part of our mission or part of our work is always bringing different voices into the university dialogue. But another big part of it is trying to give students and faculty as many reasons as possible to leave Hyde Park and to engage the city more broadly. Um, and that actually is not a bad segue into kind of what I wanted to talk about today, which is really a two-part conversation. First, about sort of the positionality of what you're doing in terms of engaged scholarship and some tools to think about that. And then in the latter parts of my sort of more prepared remarks, I wanted to talk a little bit about ways to get the word out, because the work that you're doing is not just academically of interest. The things that you're looking into, the questions you're exploring, they're important. They're important to people on our campus, and they're important to a broader public. And so I think it's important in doing that kind of academic work to think as much as we can and really as seriously as we can about the implications of our scholarship, and to think too about who might be interested in it. What good can it do beyond being seen by a narrow group of people? The documents that I'm about to share, rather than do a PowerPoint today, I actually just prepared a deck of PDFs. And what I'll do at the end of this is I'll post it to the Canvas site so that everyone has these if you find them helpful. So I would say don't stress yourself out right now trying to capture anything that you know, or take copious notes. This session is being recorded, and the contents that you see in front of you are going to be made available to you in case you find any of them useful. This is a document that was, or a chart that I modified a few years back from someone named Dwight Conquergood. Dwight was a professor, actually, of performance studies up at Northwestern University here in the city. And he mapped out this kind of really interesting question about what engaged intellectual practice looks like, and highlighted sort of the tensions that are there, that as academics, really at any level, we are always torn between, on the one hand, sort of the demands of a professional community or a professorial community, and then the questions of broader communities that might inform our scholarship. And on the other side of that, that there's this tension, I think, that we sometimes put ourselves into to make our work either purely academic, which carries a certain set of value judgments, or on the other hand, trying to make our work really relevant. I'm not here to tell you that any of those extremes are the way you should go. What I think is helpful is realizing that there's actually a lot of places that engaged academic work can go. And even work that is heavily focused in what on this visualization is green, you know, the analytical rigor category, even work that is done that tends towards these very kind of abstract directions, can still have a broader impact. And I think that's true too with the work that all of you are doing, whether it proves to be more focused on a careful reading of textiles in the case of Dinah's project, or, you know, the elevation of stories that otherwise probably would not be told in the case of Lauren's project, right? No matter where it goes, you're still doing engaged intellectual work. One of the suppositions that I think maybe goes along with that, or one of the things I'd posit for you, is that work that you are doing about human rights should at the same time advance the rights of the humans with whom you work. That is, if you're doing scholarship, it should be fundamentally humanizing, not only in its products, but also in the ways in which you conduct it. We had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with Myra Quaja, who's an alum of the college. a critical alum of the college, and works now for the Invisible Institute. So Jamie Calvin's operation that's in Woodlawn and that works on especially police accountability in the city of Chicago. Myra offered a chance. It's a great conversation, but she offered a remark that has really stuck with me. She says, you know, some research is best done by people who aren't researchers. And I think fundamentally that's right. You know, research has a discourse, research has a set of tensions that pertain to it that aren't always primarily focused on the good of the communities that they are studying. And in fact, when I am working with communities and when I'm working with external partners of the university or consulting for nonprofits about how they can work with academic institutions, I often find that I need to do a lot of translation work. In fact, the headline on this document, you'll notice, says, "How can academic projects advance social change?" And that's because I find that, quite honestly, a lot of folks out in the city who are doing work, they don't even like the word research. They find it very alienating. Or for many communities, they feel like they have been researched to death. And they think of research as a process that is fundamentally extractive. So a researcher comes from a position of privilege, enters their community, brings a very specific lens to that community's experience, imposes that lens in a very coercive way, takes what they want and leaves and never comes back. I was in a community meeting a couple of years ago where uh, the hospital of a certain major academic institution, possibly ours, was talking about a new project that they wanted to launch in some of our neighboring Southside communities. And one of the activists who was providing commentary at the end of a really long and really heartfelt and well thought out argument as to why this was not a good idea said, "But I'm sure you guys are going to do this anyway. And I'm sure when you do, we'll be really grateful for the bus cards." Because the proposal was that the subjects in this conversation were going to be compensated for their participation by being given a bus card to get to and from the interview site. It was devastating. At the same time, I think the tools of research, the tools of academics, can be used in ways that fundamentally advance human rights. And there's whole schools of thought that ask these questions. The document you see in front of you is actually, as I said, something that I will often bring with me when I'm talking to folks who are not in the academy. And I'm attempting to pitch the idea that research or academic projects or collaboration with a class or a scholar could actually help. And frequently the way that I frame this with community organizations is to invite them to think about things that they've been thinking about, worrying about, back burner projects that they just don't get to on a regular basis, or things that they wish they could investigate. Any word really but the word research. And I say, you know, there are methods and there are people who are trained in applying these methods that could fruitfully be applied to you, to your life, to your questions, and to your work. And this is kind of a translational piece. I think what's crucial in doing this translation is first an honest dialogue, but second, a really deep consideration of audience. As you are doing work, who is potentially interested in the work that you're doing? Who could use it? Where could they take that work? And don't forget that, especially in work that is aiming at a form of social change, frequently the people who are informing your research are also its audience. Lauren, your project is just screaming to me about this, right? You're talking to activists who are burning out. They probably want to know what you learn because they're probably trying not to burn out themselves. Or if they've experienced burnout, they probably want to help other people avoid it. And that's probably actually why they're talking to you to begin with, because you have the time and the bandwidth and the skill set that enables you to ask questions that they're asking themselves but don't have the time to explore systematically. Or they're so exhausted when they get around to doing it that they just need to vent, which is, let's face it, a slightly different process than academic research, right? As I mentioned, there's a whole school of thought around designing research projects or designing research as a whole in a way that is deeply respectful of these kinds of considerations. It's related to what you see on this diagram, which is really something that actually I stole from the Office of Civic Engagement at the university, thinking about sort of what it means to involve community members in this case, decision making, but I think this is true in thinking about knowledge creation as well, right? I think a lot of times in the academy, we are really good at doing inform and consult, which are the first two stops that you see here. Inform, I am telling you what I know. Consult, I'm asking you to tell me what you know so that it can inform the things that I know. But as you move to these latter stages, if you think critically about all the phases of the research process, it is really possible to involve your informants in multiple levels of asking and exploring academic questions. If you think about those same levels of engagement, it is possible, in fact, to think about the entire research process. And when I work with students on Chicago Studies capstone projects, students at the college who are working towards a Chicago Studies certificate, this is one of the things that I ask. Where did your question come from? Is it something you were wondering about, or is it something that somebody asked you to explore? The latter is likely to be more participatory and, quite frankly, much more useful. One of the things that drives me a little crazy as somebody who reads about 50 Chicago-focused BAs every single year is, respectfully, how irrelevant a lot of these questions are. You know, the reality is that we have a lot of folks who get to their third year, they panic because they need a BA topic. They're like, okay, this sounds interesting, or, oh, there's a data set for this, I'll look at that. And they never stop to ask the question if anybody is going to care about the work they did. Sometimes it's really interesting and relevant work, and I find myself sending BAs to community partners all the time because students have looked into things that they didn't know had been investigated. But people don't think about where their question came from. They don't think necessarily about the way they're approaching that question. And sometimes the approaches that we naturally come up with in the privileged world of the academy, they have unintended consequences, or the approach that we're taking accidentally precludes some of the answers that we might get with kind of a more authentic or more participatory method. Data gathering. Sometimes data is better gathered by people who don't look like me. I'm a gay white man from the north side of the city of Chicago who works at the University of Chicago. Quite frankly, a lot of doors close on the south side of the city, especially when you just say, I'm from the University of Chicago. Well, then I don't want to talk to you. Thinking about how data is gathered. I've been part of a multi-city project that gathers information about small and informal businesses in marginalized communities in Chicago and New York and a few other places. And we learned a few years back that one of the best ways to gather this data was actually to have youth from the communities gather the data. This was not the idea of the professional researchers in the room. This was the idea of the community partners in the room who said, yes, it's fine, this is good data, we need it, but what we really need are jobs for our youth. And by the way, we would love our youth to have the experience of doing this kind of data gathering. We think it would be great for them. The project took off like gangbusters, and it's been going for about 10 or 11 years. It's a really, really cool project. MAPSCORP, MAPSCORPS.org. Did you do it? Dinah, you or Lauren, you're looking familiar.
Yeah, I actually worked for MapScore the previous summer as a mapper, so I'm familiar with it.
I trained, then I probably trained one of your field coordinators. That's awesome. I love me some MapScore.
Maybe Brandon, maybe?
I built the whole curriculum, and yeah, we'll talk later. That's awesome. Congratulations. That's such a wonderful project. Data analysis. When you're interpreting your results, sometimes it's good to have, in fact, I would say in every case, it's good to have the same people who know these issues existentially looking at those results. I'll use another MapScore example since Lauren has this in her background. A few years ago, we were having regular difficulty in gathering data in a particular community in the city, and everybody was looking at this and couldn't figure out why there were problems and why so many students were getting sick, and we were wondering, was there something going on at the site? And no one could interpret this phenomenon that we were looking at. And finally, one of the mappers said, that's because there's a gang line there and everybody's scared to cross that street. Oh, well, okay. Nobody thought of that, Similarly, a few years ago, we did an analysis of quote unquote safe spaces in Austin. And we discovered that the city experts who had drawn up the safe spaces had not taken gang lines into consideration at all. And so none of the safe spaces were safe for anyone to get to. And therefore, they weren't really very useful at all. But it took someone who knew the community to be able to interpret that data in a way that was meaningful. And then finally, once you've got your data, it's really good to ask your participants and your collaborators, how would this data be most useful to them? And that doesn't just include the question of how am I sharing my data out, but also includes the question of in what format am I going to share my data? In the academy, in the world in which a lot of us move or will soon move, Brandon is moving in this direction, right? We frequently find ourselves coerced into trying to publish our findings or our results in a very specific format with a very alienating citation structure that only privileges certain kinds of sources and that can only be, acceptable if they're peer reviewed. And peer in this case means a highly privileged, extremely elite group of people who practice a very alienating form of discourse that historically, in many cases for generations, has excluded the ideas, the questions, and the voices of anyone who falls outside a narrow bandwidth that for the most part looks like me. That's a real problem because questions, issues, analyses, methods are being left by the wayside everywhere we go. So it's really important to think about the format that you put things into. The way that I invite Chicago Study students to do this, and this chart may be helpful to you, is to just ask some questions. As you're asking your question, as you're thinking about how you want to explore it, as you gather your data, as you analyze it, as you think about what you're going to do with your findings, what's your process? Who's in the room for that stage of the process? And nowadays, when no one's in the room ever, except maybe you and your dog or your cat, obviously this is not literal, right? But thinking about what voices informed the process by which you arrived at this stage. There's one of my dogs going off. I apologize. She's a Chihuahua. It's a congenital condition. What questions are you asking yourself? And in yourself or in the other people who are in the room, what are obstacles or resistances that come up? Frequently, when you discover, in my experience at least, when I run across a place where my research proposal or my question or my suggestion for promulgation comes up against something that sticks, either something in me says, ooh, that doesn't feel very scholarly, or someone else in the room says, you're going to do that with it? It's what's often happening is that there's an encounter with bias, or you're encountering some kind of a differential in privilege. And I think that it's really important to listen to those moments very carefully. Again, I go back to the founding of MapScore. Originally, we were gathering this data by sending college students and professional researchers out into communities. And the community partners, I remember the objection began quite simply with some pursing of lips. Really? You're going to do it that way? And it was the kind of thing that a researcher or a research team will frequently go right by because they'll say, oh yeah, we have the money for it. That's not the point. The point is, where is that money going? What is that money doing? What are the side effects of that? What does it mean if we send a whole bunch of people who, again, most likely look kind of like me or say, hi, I'm from the University of Chicago, and go out into community. What kinds of answers are we going to get along the way? So noting the places where it sticks, where it feels like it doesn't fit well, that's a really important check on your own process. And again, that's no matter where you are in your research. You may have your data gathered already, but you can still think about how you're interpreting that data, who's in the room for it, how you're sharing those results, and is the way you imagined sharing it really going to be as useful for the audience? I'm going to glaze past this next little document, but I want to mention it to you. As I said, we have a certificate in Chicago studies here at the university. And we use, when I'm talking to students about their projects for that certificate, which in many ways align with sort of what a lot of you are doing. And by the way, if anybody, a lot of your projects are Chicago focused, we should talk. You might accidentally be earning yourself a certificate without knowing it. And if you do, we should probably give you credit for it. And that's something that I do. But the values that I encourage students to think about as they're thinking about their capstone are, you know, is it based in authentic encounter? Is it collaborative? Does your project reinvent the wheel again? We have lots of clever reinventions of the wheel at this institution. Or have you done the background work to find out what other people are doing on this same question so that your work can build on their work and contribute to it? Are you really taking seriously the question of the impact for the people that you're talking? You know, it's so challenging to talk to people about traumatic experiences in their lives because, well, in many cases, that's a way of reactivating trauma, right? And those of us who have experienced trauma or worked in traumatic situations, we know how hard it can be to talk about these kinds of experiences. So being cautious about that and thinking not only about your intended impacts, but also the impacts that maybe are unintended, maybe asking some good questions along the way. I am always looking in student projects at the ways in which they are taking seriously the dialogue of knowledges. There are things that I know about Chicago. In mentioning Ashley's project, I know Rogers Park because I live here, right? I have an intern or a student employee who works for me he's an urban studies person, and he has this fascination with graffiti. He knows a lot about historic and present day graffiti patterns in the city of Chicago that I know nothing about except the ones that show up in my neighborhood, right? Those are two different kinds of knowledge. And those different knowledges can inform one another and can be integrated if we take them seriously. Frequently, the Academy encourages us to privilege one set of knowledges over another. But I think in doing the kind of work that all of you are doing, you have this really amazing opportunity not only to take seriously other knowledges, but also to foreground them as you communicate your own findings in a way that will encourage other people to take them seriously, which I think is so important. And that really is what these last two categories are about. Doing research in a way that is responsible. And by that, I mean truly attempting to respond to, able to respond to the questions, the priorities of those who inform our work. And sustainable. Do you do your work and hand it on in a way that is going to be useful? I mentioned that we have a certificate in Chicago Studies, and frequently students earn that certificate because they have done a BA about Chicago. In many cases, I encourage students not to submit their BA as a capstone project. Why? Well, because nobody wants to read a BA. I'm probably like one of 3 people in the whole world who cares to read undergraduate BA theses. Most of your dirty little truth, most of your advisors / preceptors are probably not going to read your BA. They might skim it. They're going to make sure that it's okay. They're going to make sure that they're going to read the earlier drafts, but by the time it's done, they're more sick of it than you are. And they don't, why? Well, it's 80 some pages, 100 pages. We had an amazing BA, Eleanor Kerala, 2 years ago, spectacularly valuable BA about the ways in which people's temporary incarceration in Cook County Jail completely screwed up their ability to take advantage of government benefits to which they were entitled, like WIC or food stamps. Such an important topic. It was 128 pages long. You tell me that anyone has read that paper. I read it, but I'm one of so few. I actually made her present the paper so that it had a chance of the content getting out, because 128 pages is just too long, too many charts, too painful. And she wanted to give voice to all these amazing interviews that she did. So I totally was with her, but it was just too long. Had she come to me and said, how do I turn this into a capstone? I would have said, well, who needs to hear this? Is it Cook County? If it's Cook County, let's distill this to a white paper that's 2 pages long. And then you can footnote your entire BA. Is it the people who told you these stories? Do you need to get a broader number of stories? Then write these up as short story synopses, even as literary memoirs in that genre, and then publish the stories back to the people who you think need to build empathy. And no one's building empathy with a BA thesis. I'm sorry, it's just the wrong form. Maybe the way to do it is pictures. A couple of years ago, Maddie Anderson won our Chicago Studies BA prize for a really spectacular BA that she wrote about reparations. And in this case, reparations for the victims of the police torture scandals that happened here in Chicago under Captain John Burge. This was mostly from the 1970s through the early 1990s. And the Posen Center has been deeply involved in this effort as well. And in fact, Maddie was a human rights intern and she finished her minor in human rights. So her BA was a public policy human rights BA. It's excellent. It's on our website now. We just did a podcast with her. Maddie, in order to, she got her question first from the Invisible Institute. The Invisible Institute said, you know, the city's proposed this reparations package. Is it a good one? We don't know. No one knows because there's no standard for evaluating reparations packages because there have been so criminally few particularly in police cases, right? So Maddie wrote her BA looking at international cases of reparations over the entire world over 50 or 60 years globally. She wrote about reparations. From that, she constructed a typology of reparations packages, and then she evaluated the Chicago reparations package in relation to that typology. Excellent public policy BA, so insightful. 88 pages long. Again, almost no one is going to read that entire BA. That was her BA. For the Invisible Institute, she simply presented them with, here is a typology for interpreting reparations. Here's how Chicago stacks up. And here are some ways that the Chicago reparations package, as proposed, could be made stronger, could be made deeper. That was an advocacy agenda that she handed to the Invisible Institute, and they ran with it. She also interviewed, based on the deep well of trust that the Invisible Institute had with the people whom they were advocating for, she had the privilege of interviewing some of the survivors and their family members. For them, she actually said, should I print and give each one of them a copy of my BA? I said, no, not unless they ask for it. But for them, she felt like the relationship that she built with all of her interviewees was really intimate and really very personal. And so she happened to be a good photographer. And so she took beautiful portraits, first of all of the people whom she interviewed, and then of herself with them. And so her response to them was to print those beautiful photographs very nicely and give the photographs as well as transcripts of their testimony back to each of her interview subjects. And then just describe to them what their work had helped to do, what their story had helped to change. I thought it was a really beautiful way of taking the same body of work and really thoughtfully thinking about who needs to hear back, who contributed to this process, and sharing back in ways that were appropriate to each audience. the fruits of her academic project. Really sensitively and beautifully done. Which brings me to sort of my last comments, which are on the representation of the work that you are doing. As you are thinking about your work, keep asking yourself the question, who is informing this? Who needs to hear where this is going? And based on the possibilities that arise in my project, who else who's not part of the conversation thus far, who else needs to know about this and be drawn into it? Again, I think our standard has, in the academy, frequently we default to kind of boring journal articles, but that's not always the best way to go. Sometimes the journey that you go on is actually most important because it's a journey that your fellow students need to hear about. If that's the case, a blog has a strong personal component might be the best way to go. Sometimes it is a website. The great thing about websites, particularly websites that are not inside the firewall at the University of Chicago, think about that, right? Sometimes websites they're so shareable. And one that really packages your content. Ashley, you mentioned, kind of a photo, a new journalism photo essay. I think that can be so evocative for people. And it translates so well to social media. So if the goal is really to raise awareness, this movement is not dead. This movement is very much alive. It is moving. It is going forward. Maybe that's a really good way to do it, particularly since individual photographs can often tell huge stories. Even better, of course, if that photograph leads into actual stories that are maybe from voices that normally get ignored in these kinds of conversations. Um, I have had students collaborate to edit electronic magazines, even to publish their own ebooks. I've had people capture voices in a kind of a really creative crowdsourcing way by using their work to theme what then becomes a contest or an art show or create an entire gallery. Southside in Focus is an RSO that used to do this so beautifully. They would hand cameras off to Southside youth. This is back in the days of actual cameras. They would have them document their own lives for a week at a time. And then they would create a gallery and invite the student photographers to come into that gallery so they could interpret their own photos. And they documented all of that as a really participatory way of telling a story. Um, I think that mini conferences or unconferences where you gather people together, you find out what stories people have to tell, and they share. Those actually work surprisingly well on Zoom. And sometimes the best way to share your findings is not to just be a talking head like I've been, but instead to propose a question raised by your findings and invite the right people into the room, and then allow a conversation to evoke the answers that you found and that others have lived into in a way that's more organic and maybe more useful for people. Sometimes the best thing to do is to say, this research points out the urgency of a question. And so I'm gathering a group of activists together to talk about what we can do with what I've learned. The how I learned it, and that's not as important. The real question is, how do we carry this forward? And don't underestimate Wikipedia. I think we all use it now and again. And sometimes there's a lot of bad fictions that are out there. I've had amazing class projects, for example, where a class makes it their mission to edit a Wikipedia page to bring in a more inclusive set of voices. It's surprising how something that is that unrefereed can become such an important arbiter of what is or isn't true. And sometimes correcting information or disinformation or rounding that information out in a way that is respectable is really important. And there are so many other ways. I've had students turn their BA thesis into a zine, literally an 8-page zine that, can help to transform the way that people think, but in a way that is so much more accessible. For those of you who are doing portfolios, I used to require an education and advocacy portfolio in a series of classes that I taught at Loyola. And I invited my students to think about ways that they could pitch a portfolio about their work that would be relevant for their own goals as well. I think it's important to think about, you're not just a disembodied brain, you're a person who is in the middle of a college career and is probably thinking about having a job after your college career ends or going on to graduate school. So it's worth thinking, as you're packaging your own work, how is this package of my work going to translate to the next audience that I need to be in dialogue with? So thinking about, how could I share my research in a way that also advances a clear sense of who I am as an engaged scholar, as a person who is in solidarity, as a person who is an activist on a particular issue, as a person who is really trying to encourage people to take seriously the work of a cause or organization with whom I'm in solidarity or with whom I'm collaborating. Um, these are things that you can subtly work into even a website about an academic project. And when all of that is done, I'll just say that, the university, especially in the last few years, has made really great advances into open access digital content. In particular, at the library, I work really closely with the director of what's called the Center for Digital Scholarship, Stacy Williams. Stacy is a powerful advocate for open access web content. And the university now hosts, at the rather easy URL, knowledge.uchicago.edu. This is an open access platform where the university in perpetuity is archiving and providing metadata on a huge range of student projects that are outside the firewall of the university, but guaranteed by the university library, so that that content will always be available. This is something that we can do with projects that you generate. We can catalog them in a way that will preserve that archive, that record. It will archive it. The university will make sure that it doesn't disappear when you forget to pay your Squarespace bill a couple of years from now. But it will always be available outside the university's firewall. And I'm happy to work with anyone to get content moved onto that platform and make sure that it is as visible as possible. That's true, by the way, even with a website that you're going to repurpose later. The university, we can still kind of create a digital snapshot of the website in a format that you like, and we can pass that on. Brandon, I am at the end of my remarks, so your digitally raised hand is fairly perfectly timed. Let me figure.
I was just gonna say, I'm not sure what, I'm more familiar with Voices, which is the university's web hosting platform that I put into the chat. But
Yeah.
it's like, for that, at least, that's all like UChicago like branded. I don't know what the
don't. I love Voices, but Voices is a UChicago platform, and some Voices sites end up being inside the university's firewall. So quite honestly, if you're thinking of making something more widely available, I would take a look at WordPress or one of the other free hosting platforms. It will also give you a much better range of templates to do what you want to do, to be very honest.
Yeah, I just meant to flag the like, even if it's public on Voices, it's like it's still branded as like UChicago, so that's like something to think about
Smart
as you're
so
putting stuff out.
Yeah. Yeah, the university has a terrible legacy narrative that we are still, and it is a matter of open debate, I think, and with good reason, whether the university is, even in the present minute, living that down or continuing to perpetuate some of the very same behaviors that led to that narrative being formed. But unquestionably, the university has not always been a good faith actor in the neighborhoods of which we're a part or in the city as a whole. And I think we really need to take that seriously. To paraphrase a Republican president that I didn't like terribly much, there's nothing strikes fear into the hearts of a Chicagoan like someone saying, "I'm here from the University of Chicago and I want to help." Most people don't trust us. with reason.
Which is why you should all be doing this work, and it's really great. So this is like how institutions change, is like people in the institutions changing them. So yeah.
And to be honest, I happen to be part of a much larger university self-assessment that we did a couple of years ago. And one of the things that is very, very clear when we talk to external partners of the university around the city, that though there is a lot of suspicion sometimes about the University of Chicago, the individual people and units with whom folks work in the city, including the Posen Center, have a really great reputation. And have really built, sometimes that doesn't, as I said, sort of pertain in people's minds to the broader institution, with good reason. It's easy to dislike institutions and harder to dislike people. But Brandon's exactly right. It's a million small interactions that can turn the university around, even though it's like steering the Titanic a lot of the time. And that also can slowly but surely evolve a bettering, if not, a complete return to health of the way in which the university is perceived inside the city.
Yeah. Well, I want to be respectful of your time because I know you have a thing coming up. But thanks for coming to talk to us. I hope that that was helpful for you guys. I was like running bibliography in the chat. Maybe I can send that out later. But
I'll
if you have,
capture that for you so that you don't lose it.
oh, sure. And then I think you can sign up to meet with Chris if you want to talk to him about something. There's a link. And then the recording of this will be made available.
Right, and that link adds you directly to my calendar. You pick the time and it just finds the available times on my calendar. And there's a range of different kinds of appointments, from a 15-minute quick check-in about like, hey, I was thinking of doing this, what does this sound like, to, hey, I really need help identifying a partner that I could talk with about. By all means, don't hesitate to reach out. And one last plug, in half an hour, well, starting in 15 minutes, but in half an hour, we're having a conversation over at Chicago Studies with Sarah Chapman, who runs a really spectacular a film archive of documentary film that tells all kinds of untold stories about the city of Chicago, going all the way back into the 60s. Among other things, they inherited the video collection of the video archives of Studs Terkel, who's a really important journalist in the history of Chicago, died a few years ago. But it should be a great conversation. And I will say, Chicago Studies is ready to support students' research with MediaBurn, both supporting things that MediaBurn is doing, but also work that you might want to do as you're coming across partners that you think are really important to elevate within the university community. Please continue to bring them and your projects to my attention, to our attention, so that we can elevate them. I would love to hear more about the work that each of you do. I'd love to feature it through Chicago Studies social media on our webpage and so on, so that the profile of the work that you do gets out there, and so that more students get inspired to do this kind of really meaningful work in and about the city, and let's face it, about communities all over the world that need our attention. Okay. Thanks, everybody. I do need to run. I'm so sorry, but hopefully I'll see some of you guys individually if I can be of any support. And otherwise, don't hesitate to email me, okay?
Thank you, Chris. Bye. Have a good day, everyone.
Recorded.
Thank you.